I went to school with a lot of the people that now build these technologies. I went to school with some of the executives at OpenAI. And so for me, I do not find there to be magic. I don't find these figures to be towering or magical. I remember when we were walking around the dorm rooms together in our pajamas, and it instilled in me this understanding that technology is always a product of human choices, and different humans will have different blind spots. And if you give a small group of those people too much power to develop technologies that will affect billions of people's lives, inevitably that is structurally unsound.
How do people like Sam Altman look at the rest of the world outside the US? What do they think about us?
They see them as resources. They see different territories as different types of resources, which I mean is what older empires did. They would look at a map and just draw out the resources that they could acquire in each geography. We're going to go here and acquire the labor. We're going to go here and acquire the land. We're going to go here and acquire the mineral. And that's literally how they talk.
That is Karen Howell, an MIT-trained engineer who spent years inside the AI industry, then interviewed over 260 people, including 90 employees of OpenAI, for her book Empire of AI. She went to school with many of the leaders of the top AI companies. She is not warning you about the machines. She is warning you about the people who own them. Listen to this.
There was a McKinsey report that recently projected that based on the current pace of data center and supercomputer expansion for the development and deployment of AI technologies, we would need to add around half to 1.2 times the amount of energy consumed in the UK annually to the global grid in the next 5 years. And most of that will be serviced by fossil fuels. We are already seeing reports of coal plants having their lives extended. They were meant to be retired, but they're no longer being retired explicitly to power data center development. We're seeing reports of Elon Musk's XAI, the giant supercomputer that he built called Colossus in Memphis, Tennessee. It is being powered with around 35 unlicensed methane gas turbines that are pumping thousands of toxic air pollutants into the air, into that community. So this data center acceleration is not just accelerating the climate crisis, it also is accelerating the public health crisis. When I was talking with some OpenAI researchers about their data center expansion, there was this one OpenAI employee who said, we're running out of land and water. And he was just saying, we're just trying to look at the whole world and see where else we can place these things. What other geographies can we find all of the conditions that we need to build more data centers? Land without earthquakes, without floods, without tornadoes, hurricanes, all these natural disasters, and can deliver massive amounts of energy to a single point and can cool the system. There have been rapid data center expansion in rural communities in both the US and the UK, and it always ends up in economically vulnerable communities because those are the communities that often actually opt in to the data center development initially because they are not informed about what it will ultimately cost them and for how long.
So there is Karen Howell, who went looking for the numbers the companies will not give you. To feed these systems, the industry needs to add close to the entire energy output of a country to the grid in 5 years, most of it burned as fossil fuel, and they are scanning the planet like a map looking for the next place to take. They are not running out of ambition, they are running out of world. Now look at what that means for the people who live where they land.
These data centers need fresh water to cool because if they used any other kind of water, it would corrode the equipment, it would lead to bacterial growth. And so most often these data centers actually use public drinking water. There are many, many communities that do not have sufficient drinking water even for people. And I went to Montevideo, Uruguay to speak with people about a historic level of drought that they were experiencing, where the Montevideo government literally did not have enough water to put into the public drinking water supply. So they were mixing toxic wastewater in just so people could have something come out of their taps when they opened them. And for people that were too poor to buy bottled water, that is what they were drinking. And women were having higher rates of miscarriages. Elderly were having an inflammation of their chronic diseases. And in the middle of that, Google proposed to build a data center that would use more drinking water. Bloomberg recently had a story that said 2/3 of the data centers now being built for AI development are in fact going into water scarce areas. I spoke with this one Arizona legislator who said, I didn't know it had to use fresh water. And for the UK audience, Arizona is a desert territory. There's a very, very stringent budget on fresh water. And after that legislator found out, she was like, I would have never voted for having this data center in. But the problem is that there are so few independent experts for these legislators, city council members to consult, that the only people that they rely on for the information about what the impact of this is going to be are the companies.
You're not telling them that actually they can't use their hose pipes for 3 months a year because all the water's going to that local data center.
Exactly.
So there is the part nobody puts in the press release. The machine cannot run without fresh water, the same water people drink, and it is being built in the places that already have the least of it. A community gets a few construction jobs and a line in a politician's speech, and in exchange, the water that kept their children alive is rerouted to cool a server farm. This is not coming, it is already done. Now, look at who actually pays for it.
So I ended up interviewing workers in Kenya who were contracted by OpenAI to build a content moderation filter for the company. And they realized if we're going to put a text generation model in the hands of millions of users, it is going to be a PR crisis if it starts spewing racist, toxic, hateful speech. So OpenAI thought, we're going to create a filter that wraps around our models so that even if the models start generating this stuff, it never reaches the user. What the Kenyan workers had to do was wade through reams of the worst text on the internet, as well as AI-generated text on the internet, where OpenAI was prompting its models to imagine the worst text on the internet. And the workers then had to go through all of this and put into a detailed taxonomy. Is this hate speech? Is this harassment? Is this violent content? Is this sexual content? And the degree of hate speech, of violence, of sexual content. The workers ended up suffering very many of the same symptoms of content moderators of the social media era. Absolutely traumatized by the work, completely changed their personalities, left them with PTSD. And it's not just individuals that break down, it's their families and communities, because there are people who rely on these individuals. So Mofat was on the sexual content team. His personality totally changed. And when he came home, he stopped playing with his stepdaughter. He stopped being intimate with his wife, and he also couldn't explain to them why he was changing. And so one day, his wife asks him for fish for dinner. He goes out, buys 3 fish, one for him, one for her, one for the stepdaughter. And by the time he comes home, all of their bags are packed and they're completely gone. And she texts him, I don't know the man you've become anymore, and I'm never coming back. For the Kenyan workers, they were paid a few dollars an hour. She was logging into a platform every day and looking at a queue that automatically populated with tasks that were being sent to her from Global North companies. And most of the time, the tasks didn't appear. And when they did, she had to compete with other workers to claim the task first in order to do it at all. And because there were so many Venezuelans in crisis, in the end, there were more and more and more workers competing for smaller and smaller volumes of tasks. So these tasks would come online and then disappear within seconds. It completely controlled the rhythms of her life in that she had this plugin that she downloaded that would sound an alarm every time a task appeared, and she would turn it on to max volume in the middle of the night because sometimes tasks would arrive in the middle of the night, and if the alarm rang, she would wake up, sprint to her computer, claim the task, and then start tasking at like 3 a.m. in the morning.
So there is the cost that never shows up on the balance sheet. The reason a chatbot feels clean and safe is that someone in Kenya was paid a few dollars an hour to absorb the worst of the internet until it broke them, until it broke their families. The value flows up to the people with million-dollar packages. The damage flows down to the people who were never told what it would cost. Now listen to how she describes the logic underneath all of it.
One of the things that I concluded by the end of my reporting was not only are these companies really corporate empires, but also that if we allow them to be unfettered in their access to resources and unfettered in their expansion, they will ultimately erode democracy. Like, that is the greatest threat of their behaviors. These companies are entering into communities and completely hijacking existing laws, existing regulations, existing democratic processes to build the infrastructure. What OpenAI often says to investors is, if you make this seemingly fantastical bid into our technology, you could get the biggest returns you've ever seen in your life, because we will then be able to use your funding to get to AGI first. And even if we fail, we will successfully be able to automate a lot of human tasks to the point where we can convince a lot of executives to hire our software instead of a labor force. So that in and of itself could potentially end up generating enough returns for you more than you've ever seen before. So that's usually the pitch that they make. One of the most underreported stories right now is the amount of risk that is not just being taken on by these VCs, is actually being taken on by the entire economy, because the money that these investors are investing comes from like university endowments and things like that. So if the bubble pops, it doesn't just pop for Silicon Valley, it will have ripple effects across the global economy. Two things that came through it again and again. No matter how long someone worked with him or how closely they worked with him, they would always say to me, at the end of the day, I don't know what Sam believes. And then the other thing that came through was I would ask them, well, what did he say to you he believed in this meeting for why the company needs to do this thing? And the answer was he always said he believed what that person believed. Except because I interviewed so many people who have very divergent beliefs, he's saying that he believes what this person believes and then what that person believes, and they're literally diametrically opposite. I think it is greatly threatening and increasing the likelihood of democracy's demise, but I never make predictions of this outcome will happen because it makes it sound inevitable. And one of the reasons why I wrote the book is because I very much believe that we can change that.
But on this trajectory, the next 20 years are like the last 20 years.
On this trajectory, for sure, I think it will end democracy. And there's a growing popularity in Silicon Valley of this idea of a politics of exit, this idea that democracy doesn't work anymore. We need to find other ways of organizing ourselves in society. And maybe the best way of organizing ourselves is actually a series of networked companies with CEOs at the top. So I don't ultimately know who's going to win, like the nation state empire or the corporate empire, but either version is bad because all of the people in power now, both business executives and the politicians, do not actually care at all about preserving democracy. They proposed the big beautiful bill, which passed the House and is now going up to the Senate with a clause that would, if implemented, put a 10-year moratorium on AI regulation at the state level, which is usually where sensible regulation happens in the US. So they're doing all of these actions now with wide-ranging repercussions that will be very difficult to unwind. That's where you really see the logic of empire. There's no moral justification for why those workers whose contribution is critical to the functioning of these technologies and critical to the popularity of products like ChatGPT are paid pennies when the people working within the companies can easily get million-dollar compensation packages. The only justification is an ideological one, which is that there are some people born into this world superior. People have a right to subjugate the inferior ones. We already talked about this like quasi-religious fervor within the AI community, and I was interviewing people who, one of the people, their voice was quivering when they were telling me about the profound cataclysmic changes on the horizon. These are very visceral reactions. These are true believers. I had the opportunity to start interviewing people starting all the way back in 2019, and there were non-believers back then that are true believers now. If they were able to stay long enough at that company, they all in the end become true believers in this AGI religion. And so there's this vortex. It's like a black hole, ideological black hole. People, when they swim too long in the water, it just becomes them.
So that is the warning, and it is colder than the ones you usually hear. Most people who sound the alarm about AI are afraid the machine will one day wake up and turn on us. How is telling you something that does not require the machine to wake up at all. A handful of people who she knew in their dorm rooms and does not find magical are being handed enough power to reshape the lives of billions, and that, she says, is structurally unsound no matter how good their intentions are. And the empire is being built in the open. The water, the power, the land, the labor, the law itself, all of it is being pulled toward a few companies. The people who make these products work are paid pennies, while the people who own them are paid fortunes. And she says the only thing that justifies that gap is the oldest idea there is, that some people are born superior and have the right to subjugate the rest. They are even reaching for the off switch, a 10-year ban on the regulations that might slow them down. Jeffrey Hinton fears the machine slips our control. Roman Yampolsky says it never could be controlled. Karen Howe points at something nearer and already here, that long before any machine decides our fate, a small group of people already has, and they have decided where you rank. Subscribe, because the empire is being built whether you are watching or not, and the people building it are counting on you not to watch.